Thanks for joining us on this panel discussion. And we are going to be together discussing and delving into the question of how philanthropic funding intersects with journalism around the nexus of impact tracking, measurement, learning, and evaluation. As philanthropy has become more and more a part of the funding streams for media outlets, the need to show the impact that journalism is generating, which we know happens, whether it's being tracked or not, has also been on the increase. Philanthropists find that this helps them to make good strategic decisions on how to make charitable donations in the support of this sector. And while media outlets themselves are increasingly finding useful ways of using a lot of the data they collect in the impact tracking. So with me, I've got a really deep bench in terms of experience and expertise in impact tracking, fundraising, and navigating the culture around this. I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with Blair.
Hi, my name is Blair Greenbaum. I'm the Director of Institutional Giving at NPR and based in Denver, Colorado.
Thanks, Blair. Lindsay?
Hi, I'm Lindsay Greenbarber. I'm the founder and CEO of Impact Architects. We do strategy and research around media impact, and I'm based in San Francisco, California.
Excellent. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel White. I'm the Executive Vice President for Philanthropic and Strategic Partnerships at The Guardian, and also the President of theguardian.org, which is the nonprofit affiliated with The Guardian to facilitate some of our philanthropic partnerships. I'm based in Washington, D.C.
Right, so just based on those introductions, you can tell we're in for quite a discussion. And let's start with definitions. It's usually a very good place to start. Impact could mean one thing to a funder, one thing to a content generator, but even within the ecosystem of content generators, newsrooms, media outlets, each of them might define impact differently. I think the best amongst us to get us going might be Lindsay on the question of definition. So help us get going. How would you best define impact?
Such a good question, and it has so many different answers, as you've alluded to. For me, I always start with the biggest definition. So we talk about just any change in the status quo as the result of an intervention. It's a really big umbrella that organizations can then find themselves under. And for any organization, the definition should be mission aligned and mission driven. So I encourage organizations to think about what some of the assumptions are that go into their reporting or their work. Who are they assuming the audience is? How are they assuming the audience is going to access and engage with their content? What are some of the assumptions about what people might do afterwards? What is the stated mission? And then from there to come up with an articulation of what impact means for your organization. And you can worry about the measurement piece kind of after the fact. I do really think getting clear on that definition is the most important first step.
Working with different outlets, have you found that it tends to generate debate trying to land on a shared definition?
Yes. In a word, yes. I think the thing is, though, it's remembering it doesn't have to be just one thing for one organization also. I can refer back to some of the work that we did when I worked at the Center for Investigative Reporting, where there was a very large definition because there were times when impact meant institutional change, government accountability, when reporting on issues of government accountability or malfeasance or lack of oversight. And at other times when you're reporting in often marginalized and vulnerable communities where the whole problem is that there isn't enough government attention, intervention, or regulation, increased awareness or increasing power in communities that can then advocate for themselves is its own kind of impact. And so having a framework that really doesn't preference one over the other, not thinking about impact in hierarchical terms, I think can actually be really liberating for an organization.
Blair and Rachel, in that order, has there been debate in arriving at a consensus around defining impact at NPR and The Guardian? Blair?
Yes, absolutely. I think you would ask 5 different people within news and programming and you might get 5 different answers. I would say that with NPR, particularly under the leadership of our current CEO, executives at our organization have given a very clear and articulated very directly to us a mandate of impact, and for NPR that is reaching a more diverse audience. And so everything we are doing right now as a media outlet is serving that, that mission. And so that is the impact we are driving towards. Now, to Lindsay's point, there are different ways of getting there, but luckily we do have that clear mandate from our leadership that that is the impact we strive for.
So it sounds to me like a change in the level of diversity when it comes to the audience.
Absolutely. So we're looking at age diversity as well as racial and ethnic diversity.
Rachel.
So when we think about impact of the Guardian, and particularly with the philanthropic projects that we work on, it's really different for each and every one of those partnerships. So, and we work really closely in these partnerships to identify what we both agree impact would look like in a certain circumstance. And that actually also permeates more broadly in the Guardian now, as we've gotten further and further into this exploration of the intersection between journalism and impact, and the reasons why we want to see impact from our journalism, for every facet of what we're trying to accomplish. But to give a couple of examples, sometimes impact is simply finding ways to report on a really underreported topic. So if something is really not getting any coverage and then we report more on it, perhaps that's the impact we want to see. Sometimes we're looking for something like share of voice, and we create a bespoke measurement framework that allows us to understand whether this topic is gaining share of voice both within the Guardian and in the larger media ecosystem. Sometimes we are looking for real world outcomes. It really depends on the topic, where we think audience and sort of wider audiences would be interested in it. There a lot goes into how we think about what impact would look like, but it is never just only one thing, or having to see a specific change in the world. We do want to always make sure that there's some increments in there that allow us to understand how we're getting towards those big changes, even if we don't get to them immediately.
And I can speak that as a funder, that is something that is quite key to the work we do. And I should have mentioned this right at the beginning. My name is Alex Jakana. I work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Been a journalist for about 18 years. And before I moved into the philanthropic work, broadcast journalist to be specific. And NPR, for the benefit of our audiences and for transparency, and the Guardian are grantees, and we've worked with impact architects as well in the past. Definition of impact is crucial for us as well. But I think what I see as a common running thread in the definitions we've all given is the word change seems to show up in each of these. So it's for each individual or for each organization identifying either an aspect or a collection of aspects where they're looking for change in terms of media effects. After we generate this content, we hope this change will happen, an increase in the diversification of audiences, or perhaps an increase in the prominence of an issue within the information ecosystem, like you just mentioned, Rachel, or perhaps a progression towards attitudes, or perhaps a reverse in certain attitudes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is quite helpful to get us on to the next thing, which is, as with all things, there is an evolution and there's a dynamic to the relationship between funders and grantees on themes and thematic discussions. When it comes to impact, how would you say you've seen this evolve and change? And Lindsay, I'm going to start with you as well, because you have worked for both funders and grantees, and quite often have found yourself in the middle.
Yeah, and before I worked together with you in the context of a consultant, I was a grantee of the Gates Foundation at CIR. Yeah. And so I find even now our work, it's sometimes working directly with newsrooms to help elaborate impact frameworks, to help understand what those goals are, how the mission kind of aligns to types of impact. Sometimes it's working directly with foundations to do the same, to help say, what is it that we think investing in journalism can do, for society writ large, or in service of other portfolios of work. If you care about climate change in the environment, why is journalism important in that space? And how would you think about the impact that supporting environmental journalism might play? And often our role ends up being kind of the mediator between the two. And so, once that match is made, to Rachel's point, you then need to have these really deep conversations between the organization and the funder about where is their alignment, not, what does the funder want and how is the organization going to deliver that impact, but here's where we see opportunity for impact as a funder. And here as a newsroom is what we see the role of our journalism as being. And, what's the Venn diagram that overlaps there? And then how can we both agree to do some measurement, potentially agree to put some resources to support that measurement, because it is labor, it is work. It is not necessarily part of the journalism per se, and so there might be an add-on there. But in my experience, the more the newsroom and the organization can have some sense for, here's the kind of impact we see, here's the way we approach measurement, here are the things we wish we could know more about, and we'd love some support and partnership to go into, then like the more fruitful those conversations are. The more power that the journalism organizations brings into those conversations, and they're not in the position then of just having to be responsive to kind of the asks and needs of the foundation. And so it just makes it a more equitable conversation, I think, and a bit less directed by the funder.
Blair, have you found this to be the case, the shift? You're muted, Blair.
That's I think by now, right? So yes, agreeing absolutely, Lindsay, with your comments. And I'll speak for institutional funders specifically, because that drives my work with NPR. We're finding that they are incredibly data savvy, and it's really the new normal that fundraisers, to be effective in their work, need to be very data literate. So not only do we need data tracking tools and databases and things like that, and quantifiable metrics that we're applying to our journalism, we need to know how to take all of that complex information and synthesize it for a funder. So data literacy, I think, is incredibly important. And there really is this demand. There's a lot of competition out there right now for philanthropic dollars, and there's this demand for proof of value or proof of investment for funders. And how do we do that? How do you prove your ROI when your mission as an organization is to create a more informed public? You do that through being able to track your impact, through tracking reach and engagement. And I think if we're able to do that as fundraisers in the journalism space effectively, we're actually able to compete for sort of the more direct service dollars that I think traditionally haven't really applied to journalism and to media outlets. But I would make the strong argument, and I think Rachel is going to agree with me on this, that in this era of mis and disinformation, quality, trusted, independent, fact-based journalism is a direct service to the American public. And we have to, again, as fundraisers, it is our job to prove it. And through data, metrics, and measurement, we're able to do that effectively.
Rachel?
One of the things, a point that I wanted to make was just about the insights that we gain from data and the kind of impact that we're tracking. I think it can be very easy to fall down a data hole, and there's always lots and lots of data. And the larger your news organization, the more data that's available to you. And I mean, at The Guardian, we have something that's literally called the data lake, which I always imagine like all of our staff like swimming through trying to find information. You could, and I think especially for smaller news organizations or nonprofit news organizations, when we start to talk about impact, it just feels like, oh my God, this is like a skill set we don't have. This will be very hard. There's so much data. How will we understand it? I think the really critical piece about impact measurement is how you discern what kind of data you want to look at and glean insights from that data. And that's a journey that we've been on at The Guardian for a while now, but it's those insights that help not only allow us to tell a story externally often about the impact that the journalism has had, what we've learned from it, what it's done. We can create a narrative around that, but also it's equally important to the newsroom, where again, just they are spammed all day long with data that comes, everything we are publishing, we are getting data back at us constantly about who's reading it, where they're reading it, how's the headline doing, all this kind of information. And it's when we can distill those insights from it and share that back to the newsroom that they get a lot out of the impact measurement process, that there's a direct benefit to them. And at least for us, that has been a distinction that really is important and has helped us on our journey.
Yeah, and I know the eyes can glaze over pretty quickly when you introduce the world of data, and it can feel like drinking from a hose, and you're just like, so the emphasis on identifying and crystallizing the why goes a long way in helping you cut out what you don't need and zoom in on what you need. And do you find that over time, what is needed evolves as organizations either grow or audiences' needs change, or perhaps just lessons are learned? Lindsay?
Yeah, for sure. And I really want to just underscore Rachel's point that, ideally this information would be used not just for communicating impact, but for organizational learning. So if you are, NPR and you're trying new audience engagement strategies and you're wanting to reach new and diverse audiences and you want them to trust you, how do you know if it's working? And then, yes, you're going to tell the funder who supported that new initiative, but hopefully you're going to say like, okay, it worked, let's do more of that. Or this time it didn't work. And so we won't do that again. We'll try something different. So in the best case, those things will overlap, but then you're on to the next initiative or the next project. And that learning should be iterative. Your kind of impact frameworks should be, structures that can change over time and can adjust. And your organization hopefully will be developing over time. And so should then what you're measuring. And never mind the fact that there are like technological changes and platform changes and our analytics change. And like, remember, right, we're spending so much time trying to figure out how to think about like video analytics on Facebook a couple of years ago. And like, we're not really talking about that anymore. And so this is a really dynamic space, and understanding though what the priorities for learning are, how it's going to feed back into your organizational strategy, and then how are you going to communicate what you're learning with your funders, with your members, with your audience, and kind of bringing folks along on the ride, I think is really valuable. And for your audience to know, like this organization is not just doing great work, but they care about kind of what happens next, and they're paying attention to what we as an audience are doing with the content, what kind of response is happening, what other media outlets are following the story. Like that's really valuable for your audience to know as well.
There's the question of culture, which is usually the big thing is you'll have one or two people, you'll have the Blairs and the Rachels in the organization who get it and they're like, yes, this makes sense. You've got a whole newsroom to bring along, the actual practitioners, and hearts and minds need to be won over. I'd love to hear some of the stories around sort of catalyzing culture change. And would you care to show some of your scars, Blair?
Yeah, this is such a timely conversation. Honestly, this morning, we have a cross-functional data working group, and the whole purpose of this group is to drive a culture of data within the newsroom. And I would also, just as a sidebar, encourage anyone who is interested in exploring this work and improving their culture of data to create some sort of cross-functional data working group and bring in voices who are not just editorial. So bring in audience insights people, bring in marketing, development, operational. All to say, I was on a call this morning where we just fielded a survey of our editorial staff about how they use data, and we learned a lot. And we got a lot of really interesting comments. So there's definitely a hunger for this type of information, and how do we sort of systematize our capture of data and evaluate it in a uniform way. But we also got the feedback, and I'm sure, Rachel, you've come across this at The Guardian, and Lindsay with your various clients over the years, where are we chasing clicks? Are we just going to become, very clickbaity and chasing the latest hot story, where instead we are a public service nonprofit organization? We need to be telling stories that really are deeply investigated and reported and that matter. And I think for us, that's absolutely a concern that some of our journalists have. But at the end of the day, the leadership is committed to doing that public service mission and staying true to that. But again, to Rachel's point, when you have this fire hose of data, it can be very, very easy to chase a story that is going to get you 1 million page views in the first 2 days. So that's something that we're really grappling right now with culture. And we think for us, it starts at the top. We're investing with support from the Gates Foundation. We're investing in leadership training in our newsroom to help bring that culture about. But like anything, it takes time. And we've been working on this initiative for a couple of years. We've made some really big strides, but we know we still have a lot of work to do.
Rachel?
I wish we knew which stories were going to get 1 million reads. You never know. I feel like we're constantly wildly surprised by what does well and what doesn't do well. But if you have like a secret little way for us to find out how to get 1 million reads, we'd love to know that. I think that something that I would say is that we've really tried to create a culture in our newsroom where there's excitement about the impact, and part of that has been sort of the wider journey that The Guardian has been on to sort of integrate our core journalism with the funding that supports that journalism. And increasingly for us, that's reader revenue. And one of the things that we know is that one of the reasons that people contribute to The Guardian is that they feel like the journalism is making a difference, that it's doing something in the world. And so it creates this, I do think it's created a bit of a virtuous circle where, journalists in the newsroom who want to be part of, a successful news organization that can continue to pay everyone's salaries and we can continue to go to work and put out important journalism that changes the world. Like it all kind of fits together. And so this idea of an impact is something much easier for us to talk about and think about than other things, like how many clicks you got on a piece of content or whatever that might be. And even just yesterday, there was we had lots of excitement because we had published a piece, philanthropically supported piece about public lands and firefighters in the West who were homeless, who couldn't afford to pay for their housing. And Congresswoman Tlaib brought it up in a subcommittee meeting, and we had the video, and we were able to turn that into a story in and of itself. But it also just created so much energy in the newsroom that a piece of content about something that we thought was important and useful could make something happen. And so, as much as possible, we're constantly trying to communicate these success stories about impact, and that happens at our daily morning conference. It happens. We have philanthropy desks set up in the US and the UK, with full editorial teams. It's communicated in those teams. I think there's actually a little bit of a competition among the editors who sit on those desks to be getting that kind of impact. And so I think success begets success, impact begets impact. The more we talk about it, the more it becomes part of the work that we do, not a burden that you're trying to achieve in the newsroom.
And if you've just joined us, for your benefit, you've had some time references to yesterday and that. This is a pre-recorded discussion. Today is Thursday, the 28th of October. So when you hear yesterday or tomorrow, use that for orientation. Blair, you look like you're getting ready to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted a point that I didn't want to get lost as we talk about impact and the definitions of impact. And one thing I think is really important, particularly in this ecosystem of dwindling local news and local journalism, which I know is another topic of this conference, and folks will probably be sitting in another panels about local journalism, is the idea of what I call operational impact. And by that, I mean impact beyond just the content that is published. So this legislation was changed, this audience behavior was changed because of a story that came out, but how are we fostering as a news outlet journalistic excellence? And with NPR, we're a federated system, right? So we have big NPR, but then we have over 250 member stations, large and small, urban and rural, all over the country. And how are we, as the top of that network, helping those stations with their own data literacy and training, with their investigations, with their editing, with their digital best practice? And our work very much behind the scenes. It's not as sexy as a big, investigative series that comes out, but that impact on the system is critical, again, particularly in this time where local journalism is really under threat. And I just didn't want that piece to get lost in this conversation.
Well, that's a good point to pull out. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'd like to dive into, there's a lot more to talk about, but the Q&A session will give us a chance to dive deeper. Let's get into a bit of the nitty-gritty. What are the metrics you guys are tracking that you're finding actually helpful? And what over time have you had to drop by the wayside because you thought, oh, this is great, and then you thought, maybe not that much? And I'll start with you, Rachel, then Blair, and then I'll come to you, Lindsay, for a sort of comprehensive view of the sector.
So I'd say that for every single project that we're working on, we're tracking basic metrics. So we want to know, how many people are reading a given piece of content, possibly what their geography is, how long they're reading the piece of content. We want to know if there's an onward journey. We take a look and see if there's an onward journey. Did they read the next piece that was recommended to them after this first piece? Those are kind of the basic things that we want to understand as sort of baseline impact for any project. But like I said at the very beginning, in each and every one of our partnerships and projects, we think about what impact looks like. So for instance, we have a big project about biodiversity and species extinction with a coalition of funders who support that. And when the project was initially conceived, it was conceived as a year of journalism that would help to critically inform wider audiences, but hopefully particularly reach an audience of policymakers. Now, that didn't mean that we were going to change the kind of journalism that we did, but it meant that we wanted to understand the funders in particular wanted to understand, did the journalism actually get into the minds or into the inboxes of a set of people who would be at an international convening, which of course has been postponed multiple times because of COVID, and in a way that might give them a little bit more information as they came into that. And so we had an independent consultant work with those funders to identify and not share them with us, a set of institutions and individuals that we just we would keep track of to see if the content had gotten to them or near them, and we were able to track against that. So, and that's just one example. There's other sort of specific kinds of things that we look for in different projects, but I think there is something to be said for some specificity on top of the basics of what we're able to do. The other thing that we've been doing, sort of a basic measurement we do on all of our projects, or a tool that we use, is a social listening tool. I always feel like I should, Pulsar really loves us for constantly saying that they're the tool that we use. But it actually has been an incredibly effective tool in helping us understand what happens when a story is out in social media. Do you penetrate wider spheres? What are those spheres? How do you understand where the journalism or where the content goes once it's out into the social media universe? And so more and more, that's part of what we want to make sure is sort of standard for all of our impact measurement.
Blair?
Yeah, I mean, largely, I think in line with The Guardian, we are tracking all of those basic metrics. So reach, audience engagement through things like, time on page. Now, that's definitely true for our digital content. We also have a curated listening app called NPR One, where, you get that fire hose of data almost in real time. Now, NPR, we are traditionally a broadcast radio platform. And so metrics for broadcast are a little bit more difficult to capture, and it's sometimes even been described as a black box. I mean, we get Nielsen ratings twice a year, and they are 6 months delayed from what they're reporting on. So broadcast can be a bit difficult. We sometimes use data from NPR One to get a sense of what's working and what's not. And I'm very jealous, Rachel, that you guys are using Pulsar in such a comprehensive way. We definitely have teams who are dipping their toes into social listening. We participated with Alex and others in a pilot for our global health and development team, and really found that information fascinating and incredibly valuable. And I think, again, for NPR, we are making this pivot to sort of our digital future. For the first time in COVID, our digital audiences have eclipsed our broadcast audience. And so we are becoming fast and furiously, sort of data experts on things like social listening and catching up in that way. So we were really lucky in February, we rolled out an internal dashboard called Sandy, which anybody at the organization has access to, and they are able to see everything from granular story metrics for an individual piece of content, or wider trends on things like listening engagement and reading engagement. So again, there's a lot of information out there, and that's why it's really, really critical, whether you're in the newsroom or in fundraising, to have a really good grounding in data literacy, to actually be able to do something with all of this information that we're getting every day.
All right, Lindsay, your guidance on how to sort through this data lake and find the right metrics that would make sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think both Laura and Rachel, what they've alluded to is, figuring out whatever platforms your content is on, and then identifying what the specific indicators on that platform are that help you understand if you're achieving goals. So if we're talking about, a digital website, and, page views might be interesting, but not actually tell you that much about the impact, right? Like, does it tell you if people are, to Rachel's point, staying, dwelling on your page, staying there for a longer time, which you could assume then maybe they're reading. So there's some awareness about the issue. So really getting specific about which indicators, when you have access to so many, matter. And I think beyond that, recognizing that a lot of impacts, a lot of that change happens, over time. And so it's not immediate, and we can't see it in the analytics, like in the day after something publishes. And that it happens out in the real world. And so the question then becomes, how important is it to know that information? How is it going to feed back into your strategy? How many funders maybe need that information for their own purposes? And then how are you going to actually go about getting that and finding the right method for that? And so, when you listen to an NPR podcast, particularly a newer podcast, and you hear them a couple times a year asking you to go take a survey, great example, right? They're asking for you to then go and tell them if you trust the content, give some feedback. It's an audience engagement tool as well. You know, it makes the audience feel valued and like their perspective matters. You can do focus groups. So I've worked with some newspapers that are trying to, like the Seattle Times, their education lab, that's trying to reach new and diverse audiences with their stories. But they can't do a reader survey because these folks aren't subscribers and readers. So how do you actually do that? You do focus groups with trusted partners of those community members, and then you can learn a little bit more about which stories are making it into those communities and how it's helping to build trust in the Seattle Times as an institution. And you find that, you know, this is working to some extent. And so really mapping those methods to the questions that you have or to the goals that you have for a project, I think is of critical importance. And so it's almost infinite approaches that you could take, but the more clear you can be about those goals, then the better you can allocate resources to answering those questions.
Now, I do realize we've come pretty much close to the end of the time allocated for us to have a discussion. We're going into a Q&A session. I'd like to round out, though, with a very quick comment from Rachel and Blair on, right, so you've harvested the data, you've processed and cleaned it, you've followed Lindsay's guidelines. How do you translate this into something that you can use to approach a funder or to continue an existing funding relationship?
Way to let us off easy. That's a hard question. Listen, I mean, I think you have to look at the funder and what their priorities are. But at the end of the day, we are independent news organizations, and there's a very strong firewall in place for a reason. So I'll speak specifically about education because that's sort of my beat within NPR. I work really, really closely with the NPR Ed team. They report on a host of issues, everything from pre-K, K-12 enrollment right now in COVID to what's happening in higher ed. There are lots of education foundations who are interested in those issues. So they may have never funded media before. It's my job to look at our story list, look at how many people we're reaching and say, hey, we are telling the stories that matter to you as a funder. Now you can't control what we're going to say or how we're going to say it, but guess what? We are informing millions of people every week about the issues that you care about. And here are some examples. And honestly, then just letting the work speak for itself. So that's what I'll say.
Rachel, final thoughts on that?
So we have a person on our team, Ellie Clark, who creates the most beautiful reports that really help, that allow you to see with such clarity what the data and the insights that are gleaned from it. And so we use those kinds of reports regularly. We report a lot. We report, I dare say, we report almost quarterly to most of our partners, partly because we need to keep track of it for ourselves, but also because it is exciting and it keeps the relationship really strong between us and our partner if we are regularly able to communicate to them what their support is making possible in our newsroom and the kind of journalism it's funding and the changes that it's bringing about. And so I think that the impact speaks for itself. We rarely have a funder that does not renew their support. And we have seen across the past 18 months, almost 100% renewal rates on all of our grants and increases because of what we've been able to accomplish with their support around really critical topics, particularly related to inequality, race, environment, and global injustice. And so, you know, I think foundations, I think fundamentally are looking for things, you know, the foundation wants to know, did we invest in something that did what we, you know, that achieved something? The data and the impact measurement is the embodiment of that in this world. That is how we are able to show to them that the investment was effective. And I think for the foundations, that's how foundations officers are able to share with their board of directors and other decision makers that it's effective. So I'd say, as painful as it may feel at some point, share the data and the insights, because it's your calling card.
An excellent note on which to wrap it up. Ladies and gentlemen, your panelists, Rachel White from The Guardian, Lindsay Green-Barber from Impact Architects, and Blair Greenbaum from NPR. Thank you for joining, and now let's go on to the Q&A.
Are we collecting it? Things like that. And so Sharon Thomas, who's our VP of operations, pulled together this team. At first, it mostly included editorial folks. And then I honestly, having just sort of integrated myself into the newsroom, heard about it and said, hey, I would like to be a part of this. I have some insights here. And then also said, we should bring in some people from marketing, some people from podcasting and programming. So we began by doing essentially an audit of the organization to find out what tools are being used and how. And then after that audit, in addition, we just sort of got people, did a pulse check on how people feel about the use of data and metrics. After that audit, the data working group came up with a series of 7 recommendations for our executive leadership on how to improve the capture of data, what metrics to use, as well as impact. And based on that presentation, we got the green light to go ahead. So we developed a roadmap, and that's what we've been working off of for the last, I would say, 2-ish years. And we go back frequently to those original 7 recommendations to make sure that we're staying on track.
Thank you, Blair. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump into the next question from Barbara. Barbara says, and Rachel, I'd like you to have a crack at this. It's her question is, she says, this is Barbara from Asheville Watchdog, a small nonprofit local online news team doing in-depth and investigative reporting. We're striving to enrich the local news ecosystem by providing our content free of charge to local media partners. We cannot get data from the partners for our stories. Any suggestions? Lindsay, feel free to join at the back of this as well.
I think Lindsay responded a little bit in the chat already. There are news organizations that are willing to share some of that data. The Guardian, we don't share extensive data with some of our partners, especially in local news, but we do share some of it, and we can, on a case-by-case basis, we can make decisions about how to share it. I think in general, it never hurts to ask if you're interested in getting access to some data, and I think the more that people ask, the more it will start to be an expectation, or at least kind of in the realm of possibility that larger news organizations would provide some of that data. We certainly have been thinking more and more about the ways the Guardian can partner with smaller news organizations or nonprofit news organizations and share the data in a way that will help them be more successful in their own fundraising or in their own endeavors, because that data piece is often the really challenging part for small places.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think there are some other nonprofit journalism organizations out there that have thought deeply about, what does it mean to have a syndicated content model, and how do you think about impact there? So the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism is one that I would point to. I know they've done really deep thinking, and I'm sure they would be very generous in their sharing there. Also INN, because they work with so many members that have this model, is a great resource for thinking about this. But implicit in a syndicated content model, if you're making your content available for free, is that content showing up in many different publications is an impact in and of itself, that's setting the public agenda, that it's bringing to light some sort of issue that has been undercovered potentially before. And so, being able to just track what those publication partners are, you may be able to do that directly through your own kind of technical backend if there's a way that they're accessing the content, or it might be kind of, doing a workaround where you're able to use some sort of media tracking, whether it's a Google News Alert or something a little bit more advanced like a Meltwater or some other kind of paid PR subscription platform. And so I would say those are great places to start. And so you may ideally want to know how many people read this story or how many people did this content reach, but being able to say we had this many publication partners, and from that we can deduce it reached a broad audience is a great place to start. And then particularly for investigative reporting, you'll likely see those ripple effects, maybe a month, maybe later, kind of down the road, where there are public officials who might be responding to the content in some way, or there are community groups that are making use of that content or that data. And just being on the lookout for those things and having some systems in place to be able to track it will help you to be able to tell the story of the longer term impact, and also be able to identify which of those publication partners are particularly valuable. Is it that it's the largest state paper that's picking it up, or is it that it's a Spanish speaking news TV station that's running your story that actually is that kind of thing that's spurring change in communities? And then you can feed that back into your distribution and partnership strategies.
That's excellent. I'll add something very small here, Barbara. you mentioned that we cannot get the data from partners for our stories. And forgive me if it sounds so simple, if you've already done this. It might be helpful to ask, why can't we get the data? And then write the bullet points. These are the reasons why we can't get the data, 1, 2, 3. It helps you to then customize your response to each of those. And some of those responses will either require extra money or extra headcount to resolve. You describe your response and how you think you would be able to overcome those challenges, and include that in an application if you're going to apply for funding for some project to a funder and say, we would like to be able to track this and this. We can't, these are the reasons. This is how we'd like to respond to it. And if you could include a line item in the budget, it would go a long way in helping. Next question. Rebecca posted this, our host, and I don't know, Rebecca, if this came from someone else, but I guess the most important thing is the content, which is, how can, and every one of us, I'd like Rachel, Blair, and Lindsay to each have a go at this. How can some of this work be best operationalized in a small news organization? If they have limited capacity for impact measurement, what is the most important thing for them to focus on? And how do you reconcile output versus impact? So many readership metrics are output related, and the community or society level impact isn't necessarily predictable. In a way, it might be for other sorts of grant seeking organizations. So pretty lengthy there, but what do you focus on? And output versus impact, and the various output related metrics. So Rachel, you go first.
So I would say if there's just one thing that you're going to use, you should use the impact tracker that they developed at the Center for Investigative Reporting. I think you could spend a lot of time wishing you had better tools to get more data that was numbers and how many people read it and how long did they dwell and all of that kind of stuff. But we often find that it's the intersection between all that hard data and what we get out of the impact tracker, which is a journalism-centered impact tracking tool that really sort of gets to the heart, or it's sort of based on the simple principle that the person who cares most about what happens with a piece of content is the person who wrote it. And that is often where we find out and we see that someone called up that journalist and asked if they could speak at an event, or they let them know that it would be helpful if they could, cite them for some kind of, proposed legislation. We get lots of really good, meaty, real, stuff that feels like real impact out of that. And we put that together with the data that we have, but often that's kind of enough. That's the really good stuff.
Yeah, I would. So +1 to the impact tracker, we also use it. So thank you, Lindsay. The thing I would say too, part of that question was, what is the most important thing to track? I think it actually goes back to Lindsay's earlier point, is it depends on how your organization is defining impact. So yeah, I would start with that and then sort of say then what metrics feed up into that. And in terms of for smaller news organizations, I think it's impossible to collect all of the impact from all of your journalism. It just comes from too many different places. Even with a smaller newsroom, you are producing an immense amount of content into the world. And so my advice would be to limit, at least initially, the editorial projects that you want to focus on. So for example, at NPR, right now we're using the impact tracker for our global health and development team. We're starting to use it with our investigative unit. So those are very richly reported stories where the tail of impact tends to be quite long. And then we're exploring the idea of using it with something we call the Collaborative Journalism Network, which is a local reporting initiative at NPR that we've been building out over the last several years. But I think, you're going to just be drowning in that fire hose of data that we keep talking about. So for smaller newsrooms, I would limit the projects, at least initially, that you're tracking impact on.
Lindsay, and while you're responding, perhaps you could respond directly to George's question in the chat about, he'd like a little more detail about the impact tracker.
Yeah, for sure. And I am, I'll drop in an email address there, and anyone who wants to have a quick demo or a chat about the impact tracker, we're happy to have a follow-up conversation. But in general, taking kind of a step back, the idea behind the impact tracker was, we use this word measurement and people's brains immediately go to quantitative data. I think what's underlying this whole conversation is that's often not that satisfying. We find out the reach of a story, we find out the number of page views, and we know that that's important, but it doesn't help us understand the deeper change that's taking place. And my background's in political science, and I have kind of a mixed methods background. And so when I ended up in this space, I thought there's all kinds of opportunity to use qualitative data. And to Rachel's point, the people who know those, what they think of as anecdotes about what's happening with the content tend to be reporters and editors. And so the impact tracker began as a way to try to centralize what, again, was kind of anecdotes, but instead to say every time you hear that a policymaker has responded to your content, that's a thing the organization wants to know about. So we can actually start to build qualitative data sets where every time a reporter gets feedback from someone in the audience that says, this story changed my life, and afterwards I took some sort of an action, that there's audience action. We want to know about those things. And then you can start to, identify trends. And so there was a question, you can't always predict what kind of change happens from content. That's absolutely true. If you start to track this kind of qualitative data over time, you might actually start to notice, you can't predict it, but you can have some better guesses about what might reasonably happen, or which strategies are, reaching affected communities, for example, or some sort of a partnership strategy or an engagement strategy that's working really well. And so the impact tracker on principle was this idea: you just create a web form that a reporter or editor could fill out in, like 30 seconds or less, that goes into a backend database, or just a spreadsheet essentially, that folks at the organization would have access to, and that becomes a data set. And so there is like a platform for that. And I dropped some links in here as well. To Resolve Philly has created an Airtable version of it. It's in that resources document. The Solutions Journalism Network put together a great kind of how to do some impact tracking that just kind of walks you through principles of how you might set one of these things up. And again, I'll drop in our impact tracker email address, and we're happy to have kind of conversations with folks. We're kind of doing a tech assessment at the moment to see what the future pathway of that's going to be. And in the moment, we're kind of beta testing a Google version of this that pulls into a Google Data Studio, so you can pull together your Google Analytics and other things together with the qualitative data. So that's like a whole different conversation for another time. But if anyone's interested, we'd love to include you in that work as it's moving forward.
Well, I guess this will be something for Rebecca and Will to sort of organize as a follow-up if people want to come together for another session. So we'll drop that squarely on their already overflowing plates. Then I would, quick question, Lindsay. Some people will be wondering, do they have to subscribe? Is there a cost implication for this impact tracker?
Yeah, not at the moment. So the kind of principle behind it is all freely available. And again, there are lots of organizations, many of those that I listed, the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, Louisville Public Media, Mississippi Today, like the list goes on of organizations that have created kind of their own homegrown version of an impact tracker that fits with their own system. So people are building it in Salesforce, they're building it into their Google or into other things. So the idea of it is out there, and people can create their own. If folks want to work with us to help set it up, then we would have a conversation about that, but the technology itself doesn't cost anything.
And I'd highly recommend working with Lindsay. She's being modest, but Lindsay is the brains behind that impact tracker while she was still at the Center for Investigative Reporting, literally built it from the ground up. So I'm going to ask, if you've got questions, you can put your hands up and ask them directly. And while you do that, and I look out for them, final question from Jessica, which I noticed that Lindsay tried to respond to, but I'd like to get Blair and Rachel's as well. Have you noticed a generational shift among journalists? And by that, she means the level of comfort with measuring impact.
Yeah, I can go first. So yes, I think we have definitely noticed that. I mean, any journalist, it doesn't matter what their age is obviously interested in the impact of their journalism, but I have noticed at least the younger demographic tends to be more interested in the really sort of nitty gritty. And I think, again, and this goes back to comments earlier, as we shift to new platforms, to digital platforms, where you have a lot of times real-time access to data for how content is performing. So yes, to your question.
Rachel, do you want to add anything?
I don't think I haven't noticed a generational divide on impact and who's interested in impact in the newsroom. And but I do feel it's not just the work that we do with these philanthropic partnerships that has, sort of given lift to the idea that impact is important, and understanding the, impact and impact measurement is important to our journalism. It's across the whole news organization. I think especially as news organizations move to models that are reliant upon individuals either purchasing subscriptions or paying for the content in some way, or in the case of The Guardian, just contributing to The Guardian to support the journalism, it's driven so much by, at least for us, this idea that the journalism does something in the world, that it makes a difference, that it's a powerful force for good. And so our ability to continuously measure that and track that it's kind of ingrained in every part of the newsroom and the news organization at this point. And I think anyone who's sort of lagging behind on that probably isn't worried about their job because we all not that you wouldn't, we all need that impact to support the whole revenue model of the work that we're doing.
That is correct. And we do know that the revenue model does need support. I was just refreshing my memory before I came onto this session again, looking at a Pew Research Center study they did. And in the 10 years between 2008 and 2018, newsroom roles and occupation dropped by 25%. I'm waiting to see what has happened since then. I don't know when they'll do the next one, but it does, anything that can help stop that hemorrhaging would be helpful. Lisa, why don't you ask your question directly? I see it in the chat. If you're speaking, you're on mute, but if you'd rather, I can read it. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I'll take that as you'd like me to read it. So Lisa is asking, curious if part of the impact tools is community success and reporting benefits being monitored. Oh, sorry, she says she can't unmute herself. Who wants to take a shot at that? Do you want to try, Lindsay?
Yeah, so in general, when I think about impact from newsrooms, this has been almost universal across every newsroom I've worked with in the last almost 10 years now. I think about impact in kind of 4 ways. There's kind of media amplifications, as we were talking about earlier, about like coverage of stories. This often matters a lot for organizations that are doing syndicated content. There's institutional impacts of policy change, government response, often kind of what we think about as gold standard for investigative reporting in particular, but that ignores the way a lot of social change happens kind of from the ground up as opposed to from the top down. And so in the impact tracker, one of the goals was exactly that, to include community success or community organizing, community networks being strengthened, and the role that journalism can play there as a crucial part of impact that we often overlook because it feels really difficult to measure or to think about in a systematic sort of way. So absolutely, and I think I mentioned, City Bureau's mission-aligned metrics, Oakland Side's Community Impact Advisory Board as 2 kind of recent examples, but that are really taking, as their mission to be community service and to build power in communities as part of their goal and their mission. And they have really interesting approaches for how they're including that in their own kind of approach to measurement or understanding how their work is actually affecting impact. So I would say, check out those models, and there are probably things that can be borrowed there. But then within the impact tracker as well, the way it's set up is that you could have network or community level impacts that you could track, so that if you're seeing content is contributing to public meetings, or that there are kind of groups of individuals coming together that are working on an issue that maybe weren't before because the content actually connected some dots, that you're actually able to track those in a systematic sort of way over time. And by reporting benefits, I think you maybe mean like maybe benefit to source if something's happening, or if it kind of leads to further stories for the reporters. Not totally sure what that means, but in those 2 cases anyway, you do see many organizations like tracking specifically benefits to sources that participate in reporting or that are cited in stories. And also, future stories or new leads that come up. And I think ICIJ is like a great example of an organization that has, of course, massive impact in their network stories, but that does follow up reporting. And so they're creating tons of content out of the impact that's happening from those investigations, both at local levels and at the international level. And so there's like something in that model that might be applicable.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, for clarifying. Lindsay, that's helpful, a really good answer. Lisa clarifies that by benefit, she means citizen agency. That's still a bit broad, but we could narrow it down to a sense of self-efficacy amongst citizens, feeling that they are able now to engage at a higher level or a lower level, depending. But this reminds me that it might be helpful for newsrooms to begin to think about pulling groups together and actually say, okay, this is some of the change we want to see because there's a reason we got into this business. What is our theory of how this change happens? And then you sort of plot that, and it takes reading and thinking things through and discussing it. It's a new area for journalists, and I can speak from firsthand, but it's quite helpful. And people like Lindsay can help. I'm sure Blair and Rachel will be happy to share their experiences as well. We're 1 minute away from closing. The chat is firing up, but I'm going to ask that each of our panelists give us a final thought before we part. And I'll start with you, Rachel, then Blair, and then we'll wrap it up with Lindsay. Rachel?
I just wanted to offer that if anyone would like to talk more with us at The Guardian about how we've gone about impact measurement and the way we think about it as it relates to our journalism, or is interested in talking to The Guardian about partnering or sharing content, we'd be really happy to have those conversations with you. So please feel free to reach out to me and we can start those conversations.
Blair?
Yeah, I will echo that offer. We're more than happy at any time to talk about our work, how we've integrated the impact tracker and things like that. So feel free to reach out anytime. I think my final thought is just for the fundraisers who work in newsrooms on the call and the editorial staff who might be here who have fundraising as part of their job. Those relationships are really, really important. And sort of, again, this idea of integrating your development shop within within the newsroom is critical. Of course, maintaining the firewall, and there are rules there for a reason, for sure. But I think those are mutually beneficial relationships, and oftentimes development could sort of like sit in a corner and nobody really knows what they do. But I think it's really, really vital to have some cross-functioning teams and integration of relationships to do this work successfully.
Thank you, Blair. Lindsay?
Yeah, my parting words, I guess, would just be to start small. It can feel really overwhelming, and you don't have to have an entire impact framework to start the work. So just pick something that feels really important to understand and try to figure out a way to kind of move in that direction. And also to remember, this is work. It is very likely that your organization doesn't currently have as much capacity as you wish you had for this. And that should be a conversation that also happens with your funders. And that should be, a line item in your budgets. And it should be part of the ask for the human capacity to do this kind of work, as well as whatever technical capacity or platforms are needed.
Thank you very much. Mickey, I see your question. We're out of time, but Karen makes a good suggestion by saying that you could attend the next session, which is collaborative funding. And on that note, thank you very much for joining this session. It's been such a pleasure. I'll hand over to Rebecca, who will point us to what's going to happen next.
Thank you, Alex and Lindsay and Rachel and Blair for your wonderful session and thoughtful insights and all the great experience you bring to this work. I've pasted the Google Doc link in the chat a few times, but just want to make sure everyone knows that there are a lot of the resources that were shared in today's chat, and I'll go through the chat and clean it up. Will also be in that Google Doc, as well as we'll add in everybody's email addresses in the event you'd like to reach out, as everyone so generously offered. There's a little bit of a break. It's 2:00 Eastern time, and we will begin our next set of breakout rooms and sessions at 2:30. And just so everyone knows, there are 3 sessions happening beginning at 2:30 for an hour. 1-ish year later, what we learned is a nonprofit, and that is with the team from the Salt Lake Tribune, journalism as a service and sustainability strategy, and a systems approach to collaborative fundraising. So I hope you can join us. You can find all the links in this morning's email, but if anybody needs anything, please do not hesitate to reach out. So thank you all so much for joining us. And again, to our wonderful panel.